Hello and welcome to the ninth lecture in our series for the course on drought. It's good to have you here today. I hope you're enjoying yourself in taking this very simple but yet very important course. Drought is everybody's business. Today we want to continue to look at the impacts of drought. And today we would look at three areas in which drought have very serious impact. Firstly, ecosystems, then wildlife, and finally, how they impact on conflict, how they can actually cause conflicts, So let's begin with ecosystems. Well, in the first place, what is an ecosystem? Okay, there are many definitions of this, and we're not really interested in giving a precise definition because that is a very difficult thing to do. But when we talk of the ecosystem, we're talking here about all the living things which occupy a particular space and which work together to make living possible. Okay, that's what we actually mean. Now, in this particular case, we're talking about biological ecosystem on the land, not in the sea. Okay, on the land. That is what we're really talking about. And when you have a drought, it seriously affects the area where the drought is taking place, which means, in truth and in fact, it affects the entire ecosystem. It affects the lives of people, it affects the lives of plants, it affects the lives of animals. And so, when you have a situation where there is limited water, or when caused by drought, a scarcity of water, all forms of plants, of animals, the soil, the streams, the rivers, they're all affected. In other words, the entire ecosystem is affected. And this is seen in many ways. Now, let's take freshwater fish, right? They live in rivers, as you know, and in lakes. When these rivers dry up, and when these lakes become small and smaller because of drought, what happens? Of course, there's less space for these freshwater fish to survive. And so, there you go. But this also means what? For people who eat freshwater fish, whose livelihood depends on that, here we have another problem, right? But it's not just freshwater fish. I just use that as an example. From butterflies to huge mammals, right? To reptiles. All of these things are affected because life is impossible without water. Life on land, that is impossible without water. So what you do see here is this, that once you have a drought, and if it's a prolonged drought, right, the soil becomes dry, okay, and from that, in other words, because soil is actually a living thing, from that, what happens is that those that depend on the soil, which is the trees, plants, they too begin to die. And those who depend on the plants, which is animals and us human beings, we too will suffer. So you see, there is a comprehensive sort of effect on the ecosystem, right? And if it is prolonged, if the drought is prolonged, if it continues for a long time, right, this could have serious environmental and ecological damage. So we have to understand that a drought is not just a simple fact of a scarcity of water. We have to look at the cascading effects that comes. And one of those is directly on the ecosystem. Now let's turn to wildlife. And again, what is wildlife? Well, basically wildlife is all living plants and animals, right, which are not domesticated, which we don't take care of through agriculture or through our gardening. They depend basically on nature. And that is the significant point. Why? So for example, you have animals and so on, and they're thirsty, you go and you get a bucket or whatever and you give them some water. You understand? They don't totally depend on nature, right? They're hungry, you can feed them with whatever. But an animal in the wild, a plant in the wild, depends on the rain, on the sun, on the forces of nature. And the moment you have a drought, guess what happens? Of course, these plants and animals have less water. And if that continues, it's prolonged, and it's intensified, the consequences for these wild animals and plants are extremely terrible. As I discussed in an earlier lecture, we remember what happened in the Sahel. Once there was this drought, animals died, plants died, the place became dry. The soil basically began to die. And so here you have it, that wildlife, when there is a drought, okay, because they depend purely on nature, right, and the conditions in nature have changed as regards water, right, these wildlife ultimately would die. And then, you know, even when it is not a very long drought, right, and it's not very intense, even when that happens, there are wildlife species which are endangered. In other words, there are very few of them left on this planet. And if we're not careful, they will disappear. Can you imagine when a drought hit an area where there are endangered species? It might mean the end of that species. You see, so therefore, we must understand that when drought hits, it affects wildlife much more than it might affect domestic agriculture, domesticated animals, because we as human beings can provide some sort of source of water for them. In the wild, this is not the case. Now let's turn to the important question of conflict. As we know, the United Nations itself was established to do what? Its first task is to maintain international peace and security. So peace from since 1945 to now has been the major focus of the international community. But let's come to drought and let's deal with this in a real way. It was Mark Twain, yes, the man who wrote The Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn, who said these words: "Whiskey is for drinking, water is for fighting." Think of that a moment. It shows you how important water is. It is probably our most precious resource outside of air on this planet. And drought leads to shortage of this seriously important resource. So guess what happens? When it becomes so scarce, what you will have is people fighting over the shortage, what is left, over the limited supply of the resource, and this leads to conflict. For your information, you know, water wars are not something new. Oh no. If you check history, you would see that the first known or recorded water war took place more than 4,500 years ago. Oh yes, it did. And so people have been fighting over this resource for quite some time. Now imagine when there's a drought and that resource becomes even less. Oh yes, it does give cause for conflict. I could name several regions of the world, but I think I'd allow you to look this up as well, right? Now, those conflicts are of different nature and of different level. So you would have conflict people against people. So there's this nation and that nation, and the water that they share has become less limited, less than it was before. And so guess what happens? Conflicts break out, you know. There's conflict between people and animals. In other words, we share the same resource. It might be a lake, it might be a river, but there's less water now. The animals need to drink just as much as we need to drink. And so this breeds conflict. There's conflict between animals and animals, right? There's conflict between farmers and pastoralists. Those who farm as in agriculture, plants, and those who are pastoralists, that is those who deal with pastures, animals. Yes, because the resource is limited, right? So drought really and truly does cause conflict, especially when it is prolonged and it is intensified. So we have looked at those three basic areas, ecosystems, wildlife, and conflict in this lecture, and the effects of drought on those things. This is real, and this is why I repeat that drought is everybody's business. Drought is the kind of phenomena that can move or change a society from one of peace and tranquility and social cohesion to one of conflict and chaos. We have seen that time and time again, ultimately leading to war. This is why drought is so important. And it's not just about the regions that might be suffering from drought at this particular time, because as we have said before, drought can affect us at any time, practically most regions of this world. Until next time, I want to remind you that if you should have any problem, please contact us by email or by phone. We'll answer your questions. Please read the material that we have offered, okay, because it would give you greater information. And the next lecture, we will focus on the severity, frequency, and spatial extent of drought. Until that time, I am Richard Byron Cox.